Hi, this is Kristen, and I'm going to be talking about section 4.3 from the Open Educational Resource Online Human Anatomy and Physiology text. It is a section that discusses connective tissue, which is one of the four principal tissues of the human body. And I've included a link that has some additional information. Some of it's repetitive, but it's a good thing to read. It's short and it shows some nice images of histological slides. So the basic functions of connective tissue include the fact that it supports tissues of the body and it binds tissues together. Some examples of connective tissues that support and bind are going to be skeletal muscle, connective tissue. So in other words, there are connective tissue sheaths that wrap around skeletal muscles and basically hold them in sort of like a bag. They surround the muscles. So that supports and connects the muscles together. There are also muscle tendons, and the muscle tendons connect the skeletal muscles to the bones, and then of course the bones of the skeletons. That's another example of a connective tissue that supports and connects one tissue to another. Another function of connective tissue is that it protects. It protects soft tissues. And one example might be the bones of the rib cage or the bones of the skull. They both protect soft tissues within them. Also, there are fibrous capsules around various soft tissues that protect the soft tissue within. And there are immune cells within connective tissue that play a protective role in that they destroy cell debris and microorganisms that can be a threat. Connective tissue can also serve to transport, such as the blood and the lymph, both of which are fluid connective tissues. They contain gases, nutrients, hormones, waste, and they transport those things from one place in the body to another. And then connective tissue can serve to insulate the body and store energy. Adipose cells or fat cells contain lipids or triglycerides, and when an adipocyte or mature fat cell fills up with fat, it insulates the body from cold temperatures, and if we need the energy, we can take the lipids out of the cells and use it as a fuel to produce ATP elsewhere in the body. Okay, embryonic connective tissue. So just as a reminder, the embryonic period of development is from the point of conception when the sperm and the egg fuse their genetic material until, well, through the first 8 weeks of development. So that's the embryonic period, and then the fetal period starts after that and continues until birth. So there are two types of embryonic connective tissue. One of them is mesenchyme. So basically, all connective tissue derives from the mesoderm, which is one of the three primary germ layers in the embryo. We have mesoderm, ectoderm, and endoderm. And connective tissue comes from mesoderm. The first connective tissue to develop is mesenchyme. The stem cells of mesenchyme produce all connective tissue in the body. And clusters of mesenchymal cells are spread also throughout adult tissue and can be used to repair and replace connective tissue when it's damaged. Now there's a second type of embryonic connective tissue that forms in the umbilical cord. Sometimes it's called Wharton's jelly, but it's also known as mucous connective tissue. And this is a connective tissue that's no longer present after birth, unlike mesenchyme. Okay, what are the the structural elements of connective tissue. Well, connective tissue is different than epithelial tissue, which we've discussed in the past. Epithelial tissue has very densely packed cells, whereas in connective tissue, the cells are widely dispersed and they're not packed closely together. In fact, there is something called ground substance, which is between the cells and the protein fibers. Now, the amount of this ground substance and the structure of each component within the connective tissue closely correlates to the tissue function. So we know that form dictates function, or structure dictates function. So the major components, or the structural elements of connective tissue, include I'll move this a little bit here. They would include cells, hold on. So we know that they would include cells, the second major component would be ground substance, which I'll abbreviate as GS. And the third major component would be protein fibers. So, what is ground substance exactly? Ground substance is basically an amorphous substance, which means it doesn't have a distinct shape. Its shape can change. It is porous, well hydrated, amorphous. It's a gel-like substance that contains proteins and is between the cells of connective tissue. It's usually a fluid, but it can be hard, such as in bone. And so the ground substance basically fills the spaces between the fibers and the cells, and it contains glycosaminoglycans, known as GAGs. And if you look at the image on the right, you can see the glycosaminoglycans. Basically, glycosaminoglycans are unbranched polysaccharide chains, and they're made up of long chains of repeating disaccharide units. So basically, it's like a repeating sugar unit. And it also has proteins in it. What's most important to know about GAGs is that they're negatively charged, and so they attract positively charged ions or cations, such as sodium. And that, in turn, attracts water. So a lot of water is sucked into the ground substance. And that's why it's said to be well hydrated. In addition to that, its molecular structure gives it the quality of being inflexible. It has long sugar chains that remain extended and they can't really fold up. And then also, it's strongly hydrophilic, which means that it likes water, and it happens to be in attracting a lot of water. So basically, GAGs form this matrix that's very much like a sponge. It just kind of sucks up the water, and that's what makes it such a porous, hydrated, transparent gel. What the qualities it has as a result of the function are that it is really good at resisting compressive forces. So anything compressing it um, will not be able, it's going to be particularly strong at resisting that. It has large spaces between the fibers and the cells, well, at least between the cells, and so molecules can diffuse throughout that ground substance space. The ground substance, in combination with the fibers in the cells, make up what we call the extracellular matrix. It's like a big cellular soup. And in some cases, the extracellular matrix is solid, as in bone. In other cases, it's liquid, as in blood. And in some cases, it's kind of soft and gel-like. Okay, so we'll do a quick review of stem cells, which you probably would have discussed in cell biology for health occupations. So just to go over this, stem cells, the term totipotent or omnipotent, those types of stem cells can become any cell in the body as well as the placenta. So basically they can become extraembryonic and embryonic tissue. You could make a whole organism out of totipotent stem cells. Now, pluripotent stem cells are a little more limited, but they can give rise to all the cells in the body, just not the placenta or the extraembryonic cells. Now, multipotent stem cells are even more limited than pluripotent stem cells. They can give rise to cell types within a closely related family of cells. So, oligopotent cells, those types of stem cells can differentiate into just a couple cell types. And one example would be blood cells, like the lymphoid stem cell or the myeloid stem cell, that give rise to the different types of blood cells. So those would be oligopotent stem cells. Now the unipotent stem cell, they can only produce one cell type, but they're considered to be stem cells because they can self-renew, and so it makes them different than progenitor cells. Okay, so again, want to remind you that multipotent stem cells can give rise to all of the cell types within a closely related family of cells. And the reason I reemphasize that is because I wanted to talk about the cell types of the connective tissue. Okay. I just want to remind you that a cell that ends in the suffix blast is the active form of a cell, meaning that it can secrete the ground substance components of connective tissue. It divides, it can secrete ground substance. Now, a cell that ends in the suffix site is the mature inactive form of the cell. And it often is just involved in maintaining the connective tissue. So we have three cells to discuss that end in blast. The fibroblast, it secretes proteins and polysaccharides, which then combines with the extracellular fluid. And the fibroblast is the most abundant cell in connective tissue proper, which is one type of connective tissue. We also have fibrocytes, which would be the mature inactive form of the cell. Now, a chondroblast is the cell that secretes the ground substance in cartilage. And we also have chondrocytes. And then the osteoblast is the active form of the cell in bone that secretes the bone ground substance. And we also have osteocytes, the mature inactive bone cell. Okay. Now, adipocyte An adipocyte is a mature, inactive fat cell. And we have basically two types of fat cells. We have white fat and brown fat. The white fat cells, or adipocytes, are abundant in the adult. They are mostly made up of fat. The fat takes up the entire cytoplasm, well, most of the cytoplasm, and the fat comes in the form of a large single droplet. Now, infants have abundant amounts of brown fat, and brown fat's different. Brown fat is more limited in adults. It can be found in the region of the collarbone. It can also be found around the neck, but it's fairly limited, though it can vary from one person to another. And brown fat contains fat in several droplets, and they have mitochondria, which makes them a metabolic tissue. But rather than making a lot of ATP, they're considered to be thermogenic. So basically, brown fat breaks down lipid and generates heat. Converts the stored lipid energy into heat energy. So it's a thermogenic tissue. It's a highly metabolic tissue. Now, a mesenchymal cell is multipotent. It's a multipotent adult stem cell. So again, just to remind you, the multipotent cell can give rise to cell types within a closely related family of cells. And that's basically what mesenchymal cells do, is they give rise to new connective tissue. Now, connective tissue also has macrophages, and macrophages are a large cell that derived from a monocyte, which is a type of blood cell that functions on behalf of the immune system. A macrophage can engulf and destroy microorganisms and dead cells. And then, of course, we have a mast cell. Now, mast cells are found in connective tissue proper, and there is a picture of one at the right, and what makes them easier to identify is the fact that they have granules in their cytoplasm, and you can see the granules as little dark spots. They are responsible for creating this allergic response in people. They can lead to inflammation and redness and an influx of blood and other blood cells. And sometimes we will buy antihistamines to try to alleviate some of the symptoms that accompany the allergic response. They can also secrete heparin. Okay, let's talk a little bit about connective tissue fibers and ground substance. Now, connective tissue fibers are secreted by fibroblasts. And there are basically three major types of fibers. We have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. However, if we really wanted to get specific, we could talk about the fact that there are actually three types of collagen fibers. And one type of those collagen fibers is actually used to make reticular fibers. But we are mainly going to focus on three main classes of fibers. So collagen fibers are long protein strands. They're long fibrous strands that are particularly good at resisting tension. And we can have thick collagen fibers and we can have thin collagen fibers. But collagen is very good at resisting pulling forces. Now, elastic fibers contain a protein called elastin. And that protein gives elastic fibers the quality of being elastic, which means that they can recoil to their original shape and size when they're stretched and then released. And then reticular fibers Reticular fibers are basically made up of a thin type of collagen fiber. So they're not thick and coarse collagenous fibers. They're very thin, and they create this branching fiber that provides the structural support for parenchyma. Okay, what is parenchyma? I should probably write that down. Parenchyma so reticular fibers provide the support for parenchyma. And parenchyma can be described as basically the functional cells, blood vessels, and nerves of organs. So, reticular fibers provide this basic scaffolding or skeleton of support for soft tissues within organs. Now, ground substance, as I mentioned, ground substance is made up of the gags, which I described earlier, which are the glycosaminoglycans. Again, ground substance is a transparent, colorless, amorphous, gelatinous substance, gelatinous in most cases, with these glycosaminoglycans, or gags, which are basically like a hybrid of protein and carbohydrate. And they link together to form even larger molecules called proteoglycans. So gags link together to form larger proteoglycans. And ground substance contains polysaccharides such as hyaluronic acid and proteins. And again, the types of fibers and the ratio of fibers to the amount of ground substance is what dictates the properties and the functions of these different types of connective tissue. And if you could think of this being the ground substance in yellow, and then we can have cells in that ground substance, and then we can have fibers, and imagine that yellow ground substance filling in everything. It's the ground substance gives the ability of this connective tissue to be kind of fluid yet strong, unless it's in bone. Okay. So, wanted to show you, just remind you of that picture of the gags. So here's an example of these strands of gags that are attached to a big protein. And it basically, you take many gags joined together to this piece of protein to form this proteoglycan that makes that ground substance really hydrated and inflexible. The protein fibers themselves make things quite flexible in connective tissue. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different classes of connective tissue. The different types of connective tissues. So first we can divide them into three major classes, and the three classes again are going to be different from one another based on the ratio and the amount of ground substance and the types and amounts of those three types of fibers we just discussed. The first major class is connective tissue proper, and connective tissue proper includes two basic types. One is loose connective tissue proper, and the other would be dense connective tissue proper. So dense regular connective tissue and loose regular connective tissue have names that pretty much describe them pretty well. So loose connective tissue proper has really loosely arranged fibers. The fibers have large spaces between them, and those spaces are basically filled with ground substance. Loose connective tissue proper is really good at absorbing shock and at binding tissues together. There are basically three types of connective tissue proper. There's areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue or fat, and then reticular tissue. Now, dense connective tissue proper is dense. So basically, the fiber bundles are really densely packed together in bundles. And the fibers themselves provide a great deal of strength. The fibers provide strength, elasticity, and protection. Now, if the fibers are elastic fibers, the tissue is going to be much more elastic and better at recoiling to its original shape after it's been stretched. However, if there are a great deal of thick collagen fibers, it's going to be particularly good at resisting pulling forces. The three types of dense connective tissue are regular connective tissue, irregular, and elastic. And we'll look at each of those. Now, supportive connective tissue is the second major class, and it does just what it says. It provides structure and strength, and it basically protects soft tissues. Examples include cartilage and bone. There are three basic types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage, and we'll look at an example of each of those. And then bone, which has a calcified, rigid extracellular matrix. So instead of being gelatinous, it's hard. There are two types of bone: compact or cortical bone, and then the second type would be spongy bone, also known as trabecular or cancellous. The third major class of connective tissue are the fluid connective tissues, and there are two types: blood and lymph. Fluid connective tissue consists of specialized cells that circulate in this watery extracellular matrix of salts, nutrients, and dissolved protein fibers. So all connective tissues have protein fibers, but in the case of the fluid connective tissues, the fibers are dissolved in the matrix. In the case of blood, you can't really see the fibers when it's in its liquid form. However, if you suddenly cut yourself, a chain reaction occurs that leads to the fibers coming out of solution, and that's basically what forms the blood clot and stops a person from bleeding to death. So all connective tissues have this extracellular matrix with fibers and cells, even if they're not readily obvious, as in lymph or blood. So we'll take a look at each of those. Now, this first image shows both a microscope slide and a schematic of the connective tissue proper. And what you'll notice about connective tissue proper is that connective tissue proper has fibroblasts that produce the fibrous tissue. Connective tissue proper has fixed cells, in other words, cells that don't necessarily move to different tissues. They don't move into the blood and get transported around the body. And the fixed cells would be fibrocytes, adipocytes, and mesenchymal cells. And we can see a mesenchymal cell. Right, this is a mesenchymal cell here and an adipocyte here. And then a fibrocyte is shown over here. There's a fibrocyte, an adipocyte full of lipid, and a mesenchymal cell there. Okay, so this is an example of white fat, not brown fat. So each individual cell is an adipocyte that contains mostly stored lipids in its cytoplasm. Here you can see the little nucleus, but that it's mostly filled with lipid. And this is an actual microscope slide where you can see the white area is the part that contains the lipid or the triglyceride. And as we gain fat, we simply add triglyceride to the cells and they get larger. And as we lose fat, as we burn more calories than we take in, then our fat cells become smaller. And the number of fat cells and the size of them is going to differ between individuals. And we carry the majority of our fat in the hypodermis, that subcutaneous layer, which is below the skin. We do have some fat packed around organs called visceral fat, and it serves to hold the organs in place and to cushion them. And as we age, we have a tendency to redistribute our fat, so that we tend to lose fat in the subcutaneous area of the body, and we tend to gain fat in the visceral area. And visceral fat can become dangerous and lead to metabolic problems such as type 2 diabetes. Okay, but fat is basically a loose connective tissue. It's one type of loose connective tissue here. Okay, moving on. Again, I want to reiterate that the brown fat, which is abundant in infants and rare in adults, is thermogenic, breaks down fats, and releases metabolic heat, not ATP. White fat is not metabolic, and that's what we tend to have as adults. The adults have a little bit of the brown fat in the neck and clavicular region, although it varies between people. Okay, the second type of loose connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. And this image is taken from the 10th edition of Human Anatomy and Physiology, written by Elaine Marieb and colleagues. This areolar tissue is the most widely distributed connective tissue in the body. It underlies most epithelial tissue. In fact, I told you when we were studying epithelium that connective tissue always supports epithelium. It's always deep to the epithelial layer. Well, the connective tissue component of epithelial membranes, such as mucous membranes, serous membranes, and the cutaneous membrane, is lamina propria. So lamina propria is the name that we give that areolar connective tissue that supports the epithelium. And you can see that right here. Okay, so in this image you can see that the connective tissue proper has a gel-like matrix, shows up as a light color. It's got 3 fiber types. It's got collagen fibers, it's got elastic fibers, and it has reticular fibers. Notice that the collagen fibers that are shown in kind of a pinkish color are really thick compared to the elastic fibers, which are much thinner and are made of that elastin. Other cells within this would be fibroblasts, macrophages, mast cells, and then some leukocytes, which are white blood cells. So basically, this areolar tissue is responsible for cushioning and wrapping around organs. It contains tissue fluid or interstitial fluid, the fluid between the cells. You can find this surrounding the capillaries, since capillaries are made up of or contain an endothelium within them. And you can find it packaging organs. Okay, let's look at another type of loose connective tissue, reticular tissue. Reticular means little net. And the places that you can find reticular tissue would be in lymphatic tissue, such as the spleen, for example. You can also find it in the liver, both of which are soft organs, and reticular tissue supports soft organs. So the reticular fibers look different than the elastic fibers and the collagen fibers. You'll see that when you look at these fibers, they don't look quite as straight as the other fibers that we've looked at. Reticular fibers basically make up this loose network in a gel-like ground substance. The reticular cells themselves actually lie on the network of fibers. They function to perform this soft internal skeleton called a stroma. Stroma is S-T-R-O-M-A, and that's the soft internal skeleton that supports other cells, such as leukocytes or white blood cells, mast cells, and also macrophages. You can find reticular tissue in the lymph nodes, the spleen, the bone marrow, and a whole bunch of other lymphoid organs. Okay, now we have talked about all three types of loose connective tissue. Areolar, which makes up the lamina propria. We've talked about adipose tissue, and we've talked about reticular tissue. Now it's time to move on to the dense connective tissue instead of the loose connective tissue. And dense connective tissue is densely packed, unlike the loose connective tissue. So it doesn't have a lot of space filled with ground substance. It has densely packed fibers. Dense connective tissue contains many more collagen fibers than loose connective tissue, so it has even a greater resistance to stretching. And there are basically three types of dense connective tissue. There's regular, irregular, and elastic. And when we look at the irregular tissue, I'm going to look at the regular first. When we look at the regular tissue, which is shown here, I want you to notice that it has these fibers that are parallel to one another, and they're kind of whitish color. And all of the fibers being parallel are oriented in the same direction, so they're going to be particularly good at resisting pulling forces in that direction. Also, you can see fibroblasts within the tissue that are secreting the ground substance. There are mostly collagen fibers, but there are a few elastic fibers, and the major cell type is the fibroblast. They basically function to attach muscles to bones in the form of muscle tendons. They attach bone to bone in the form of ligaments, and they're really good at resisting tensile or pulling forces in one direction. You can find them in tendons, ligaments, and aponeuroses. An aponeurosis is basically a flat sheet-like tendon. Aponeurosis is A-P-O-N-E-U-R-O-S-I-S. Aponeurosis, a flat tendon. Now, the irregular dense tissue, what's different about it is the fibers are not parallel to one another. In fact, they kind of seem like they are oriented in every direction imaginable. And these fibers include collagen fibers, mostly. They're just irregularly arranged, and some elastic fibers. The major cell type, again, is still a fibroblast. And because the fibers are oriented in every direction imaginable, this is a tissue that's good at resisting pulling forces in pretty much every direction. And so you can find the irregular connective tissue in the dermis of the skin, so our skin can be pulled every which way, but you can also find it in the fibrous capsules of joints and organs. Also in one of the layers of the digestive tract called the submucosa. Okay, now there's another type of dense connective tissue called elastic connective tissue, and it looks like it has densely packed fibers when you look at it. It's just that the fibers, there's a lot more elastic fibers than there are collagen fibers, and these elastic fibers are these kind of wiggly little black lines here, and they almost remind me of an elastic waistband. Because they have a lot of elastic fibers, they're really good at being stretched and then recoiling back to their original shape. So they're going to be found in any organ or tissue that's going to be stretched, such as in arteries. You can find this elastic, dense connective tissue in the aorta. So the aorta receives blood from the left ventricle, and when it receives it, the aorta stretches out, and then as the blood pulses away from the aorta contracts, just kind of like the heart does. So you can find this in the walls of large arteries, in ligaments that are associated with the vertebral column, which have to get stretched, and also in the walls of the airways that lead to the lungs, called the bronchial tubes. Okay, let's talk about the different types of cartilage. Okay, well, actually, before I talk about cartilage, I just want to mention that there's a homeostatic imbalance associated with one dense connective tissue. And it's worth mentioning because it's fairly common. Tendons, which are made up of that dense regular connective tissue that we were just discussing, tendons can sometimes become inflamed from overuse, and it's called tendinitis. And because tendons don't have an abundant blood supply, they heal pretty slowly. So if a person develops tendinitis, the area becomes swollen and sore, and usually the tendon is close to a joint, and the best thing you can do is to rest it and ice it and try to bring the inflammation down. And if a person ignores the advice to rest that body part, then it can actually lead to a ruptured tendon, which often has to be repaired surgically. It's because again, tendons don't have an abundant blood supply and they heal pretty slowly. Now that brings us to our next major tissue type, cartilage. Cartilage also is a tissue that heals really slowly. It's avascular, so it's completely without blood vessels, and so nutrients have to actually diffuse through the extracellular matrix to reach the chondrocytes, which are those mature inactive cells within the cartilage. So cartilage is a connective tissue that consists of protein fibers like collagen embedded in this semi-firm extracellular matrix of chondroitin sulfates. And basically chondroitin sulfates are polysaccharides that bind with ground substance to form proteoglycans. And proteoglycans, like I said, are those, I already described them when I was talking about the ground substance of connective tissue. Okay, so of these three types of cartilage, hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage, elastic cartilage is the most rare, and hyaline cartilage is the most common. Hyaline cartilage is shown here. You can also see it if you click on that link that's on the very first page of the slide. It'll take you to a website that has a picture of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage provides a lot of support, but it's also somewhat flexible. And it has these short and dispersed collagen fibers and large amounts of proteoglycans. It has a very smooth surface, so it appears clear, and it's really strong and flexible. It's good that it has a smooth surface because that's where, well, hyaline cartilage is found on the ends of bones that meet at joints. And so when these smooth surfaces contact one another, they're more likely to slide over one another fluidly, which brings us to the fact that there's actually a real slippery fluid that comes out of the cartilage when we compress them. And it provides this thin layer that allows one piece of cartilage to slide over the other. It's the most common type, and it's found at the ends of all of the bones. And it's often referred to as articular cartilage. It's amorphous, even though it has a firm matrix. Lots of collagen fibers that form this sort of imperceptible network. The chondroblasts produce the ground substance, and when they're mature, they become chondrocytes. And chondrocytes are found in little lacuna, just like osteocytes are found in lacuna in bones. A lacuna is just a little space that houses the chondrocytes. So the chondroblast basically secretes the ground substance, and then it becomes a chondrocyte in a lacuna, much like bone. Hyaline cartilage supports and reinforces. It's a very resilient cushioner, and it's really good at resisting compressive forces, which is exactly what we use it for, because it's between our long bones. So when we're standing on our long bones, like our leg at the knee joint, the cartilage is withstanding most of the weight of the body. It forms most of the embryonic skeleton. So we start off with a cartilage skeleton of long bones, and then it's replaced by bone. It also covers the ends of long bones and the joint cavities. It forms the costal cartilages. Costal is rib, so it forms the cartilages of the ribs. It also forms the cartilages of the nose and the trachea, which is the windpipe, and the larynx as well. Okay, the second major type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage is really good at being compressed. It's great at absorbing pressure. And the reason being, it has very thick bundles of collagen fibers in the extracellular matrix. So it's similar, it has a matrix that's similar to hyaline cartilage, but the fibers are much thicker. Much thicker collagen fibers. It's a different type of collagen fiber. And it offers tensile strength, but it's really good at absorbing compressive shock. And because of that, you can find it in the intervertebral discs, so it makes up the discs of your back. It's also found in the pubic symphysis, so between the two pubic bones, and also the discs of the knee called the menisci. We have a medial and lateral meniscus in our knee joints. It's this kind of C-shaped pad of fibrocartilage that helps improve the fit of the femur and the tibia, and it also provides resistance. Well, it's kind of a shock absorber, basically. And then the elastic cartilage, which you can see here, this is the most rare type of cartilage. It is similar to hyaline cartilage, but it has a lot more elastic fibers in the extracellular matrix. So that helps maintain the shape of the structure, but it also makes it extremely flexible. So we can find this in the external ear. If you bend your ear, you can see how flexible that is. That is elastic cartilage. It's also found in the epiglottis, which the epiglottis is involved in routing food into the esophagus as opposed to the trachea or the airway. Okay, so the next major type of connective tissue would be bone. And bone comes in two forms. Ah, shoot. Hold on. I gotta rewind a minute. Forgot to mention something. Something important. Before we move on to bone, there's something called a perichondrium. You've heard of a periosteum that surrounds bone. Well, a perichondrium is similar. It is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that encapsulates cartilage. So it surrounds the cartilage. Now, when we go to bone, when we look at bone, bone has something called a periosteum. And the periosteum is similar. It's analogous to the perichondrium. It's connective tissue that surrounds or encapsulates the bone, and it comes in two layers, as I've mentioned already in class. The outer fibrous layer and the inner layer made of osteogenic layer of cells, which can basically differentiate. They can differentiate into osteoblasts, which produce more bone, for example. So this first type of bone shown here is compact bone, and then I'll show you spongy bone. Now, bone is the hardest connective tissue in the body. It is highly vascular, unlike cartilage, and so it does have the ability to heal itself. It has a rigid extracellular matrix that contains mostly collagen fibers embedded in a hard mineralized ground substance. The ground substance contains hydroxyapatite crystals. Okay, hydroxyapatite is a form of calcium phosphate, and I mentioned that in class. This is the mineral portion of the bone that gives bone its hardness. You'll also note, though, that bone includes an organic portion made up of primarily of collagen fibers and some cells, although there are many more fibers in ground substance than there are cells. The fibers give bone its flexibility. So it's good that we have both a hardness and an aspect or a characteristic of being flexible, because if it was all mineral, it would shatter and be very brittle. But if it was all organic material, it would be likely to not be able to support the weight of the body. The types of cells that you can find include osteoblasts, which produce the organic part of the extracellular matrix. And the osteocytes are the mature, inactive bone cell that are found in those little spaces called lacuna. And you can see osteocytes and lacuna right here. So the little dark spots are osteocytes and lacunae. The central canal is shown here. It contains blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. And the major functional unit of compact bone is called the osteon, also known as the Haversian system. So this is a repeating unit in compact bone, and this entire thing here, oops, hold it, this circular area here is the osteon. The central canal includes the blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels, and then we have lamellae, which are these rings of extracellular matrix, kind of like the rings of a tree, and the osteocytes are found between the rings, and the osteocytes are connected to the periosteum and the central canal by these little canaliculi, which are little tiny hair-like channels that formed when the osteoblast became trapped in this calcifying matrix. Once it became solid, the osteocytes remained trapped, and their long extensions, kind of like tentacles, help form those canaliculi. And I talked about that in class quite a bit. Okay, so there is no repeating unit in the spongy bone. We have an osteon and compact bone, but if we take a look at the spongy bone, what we see are these struts of bone that create this lattice-like network of mineralized bone tissue, and then it has these big spaces like you would find in a sponge, and that's spongy bone, but there's no repeating unit. The combination of the organic, inorganic components, the compact and the spongy bone, give our bones the ability to be strong yet still light. Okay. Okay, the function of bone is basically that it supports and protects by enclosing soft tissues, supports our body weight, it provides levers so muscles can pull on the bones and allow movement. It also stores calcium and phosphate. It even stores fat in the yellow bone marrow. And in the red bone marrow, located in some parts, it produces red blood cells. So that brings us to blood. Blood is the very last type of, well, fluid connective tissue. Fluid connective tissues are the last types of connective tissues. And in a fluid connective tissue, such as blood and lymph, cells circulate in this liquid extracellular matrix. The formed elements of blood are derived from hematopoietic stem cells in the red bone marrow. And the major components of blood include the liquid extracellular matrix, which is called blood plasma, and then erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells, which you can see abundant erythrocytes in this microscopic slide of blood. And then leukocytes are white blood cells, and you can see fewer leukocytes in the image, and these look different than red blood cells. They're usually, when they're stained, appear kind of purplish, and there are different types of white blood cells. And then platelets. Now I don't see any platelets, but platelets are cell fragments that are involved in blood clotting. So the leukocytes, or white blood cells, they function on behalf of the immune system. The red blood cells primarily transport oxygen and some carbon dioxide throughout the body. And the platelets are involved in blood clotting. Now lymph is also a liquid connective tissue. Lymph is actually made from blood, so it is similar to blood plasma. It again has a liquid extracellular matrix, and both of the liquid extracellular matrices of blood and lymph contain fibers that are dissolved in the fluid under normal circumstances. And then the leukocytes, the white blood cells, are also found in lymph. And basically lymph is found in extremely permeable lymphatic vessels in the tissues. And when blood plasma leaks out of the tissues, it, as well as other substances, can enter the lymphatic vessels, and the lymphatic vessels serve to return the fluid portion of the blood back to the blood. And along the way, the lymph passes through lymph nodes, which basically filters the blood and works on behalf of the immune system. Okay, so I'm about done here, but I just wanted to, again, highlight the three basic classes of connective tissue. connective tissue proper, supportive connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. There were two major types of connective tissue proper: loose, which is loosely arranged and includes areolar, adipose, and reticular. And then the dense connective tissue, which has densely packed protein fibers, and that includes regular, like tendons, irregular, like the dermis, and then elastic, which you find in the aorta. Supportive connective tissue includes cartilage and bone, and there are 3 types of cartilage, 2 types of bone, and 2 types of fluid connective tissues. All right, so you can see there are many different types of connective tissues, and this is basically a lead up to the fact that we're going to be discussing bone, and I've already started discussing bone, which is that hard connective tissue, and then eventually we will discuss blood, the fluid connective tissue. That'll happen a little later in the term though. So I'm going to go ahead and close now, and I will include a lecture on the last part of the bone tissue in chapter 6, and I'll do that soon. Thanks.